You know, it's funny. I play the Spark the Electric Jester games for the first time at the start of the year, and then the third game comes out later that same year. Seriously, what are the odds of that happening? That was a rhetorical question, to clarify. But yeah, as some of you might recall, I took a look at the first two Spark the Electric Jester games earlier on in the year. A duology of indie platformers both developed by a single man, Philippe Ribeiro Deniluz, better known as LakeFeperd. He was well known prior to then for his Sonic fan games, before the sequel, after the sequel, and Chrono Adventure. But then he took that experience into creating his own original IP, that being, well, Spark the Electric Jester. The first of these games, released in 2017, was a 2D platformer that did still have some of that Sonic flair present, but also fused it with some Kirby-inspired mechanics, namely in Spark's various Jester powers. It gave the game a unique identity, and while it had some issues here and there, particularly some frame rate problems and some really annoying enemies closer to the end of the game, I overall really enjoyed my time with Spark 1. Unfortunately, the game didn't get a ton of attention. Sonic Mania coming out soon after probably didn't help matters, but even still, that didn't stop LakeFeperd, and in 2019, we got Spark the Electric Jester 2. Unlike the first game, this one was a 3D platformer, bringing the Kirby elements down to a minimum in favor of making the game closer to the style of the Sonic Adventure games. Looking back, while it was disappointing to see the Jester power system minimized, I do get why it was. Translating a lot of these powers to a 3D space probably wouldn't have been the easiest process. Just look at how much Kirby had to cut down for Forgotten Land. I can only imagine how much more extreme it'd be for a solo indie dev. I actually replayed Spark 2 not long before Spark 3 came out, both as a refresher and to record new footage. And honestly, I think I enjoyed it more on the second outing. Granted, I do still have some issues with the combat, but I did find it a bit more fun than before, especially when properly mixing light and heavy attacks together. It gives it a bit more weight. Needless to say, I quickly became a Spark fan after playing these games, and at the time of me doing so, Spark 3 was already announced and on its way, with a demo being available for it. This got me really excited for the third installment, and at the time of me making that first Spark video, I had no idea how much longer we'd be waiting to get Spark 3. Well, sure enough, this past June, LakeFeperd stated that he was aiming to get Spark 3 out this September, and that was exciting to see. And then on August 9th, he dropped a release date trailer, revealing the game was coming out on August 15th? That was less than a week away at that point. Okay, that's very exciting. Alright, August 14th rolls around, one more day to go. Nope, psych, he launched it today. And I thought I had a bad habit of releasing stuff earlier than planned. In any case, here we are now, just over half a year after I played Spark 1 and Spark 2 for the first time, with Spark the Electric Jester 3. To say I'm excited to play and review this is understating it. I've been looking forward to this for a fair bit now. Though, before we begin, I want to quickly note two things. One, I apologize for any visual hiccups that may occur in the footage. My computer was being a bit stubborn while I was recording my playthrough, and while I don't think it'll be too distracting, you may notice some very brief freezes in the footage. I'll do what I can to edit around that, but yeah. 2, I'm actually going to start with a quick recap of the major plot beats from Spark 1 and 2 before we talk about Spark 3's story, both as a refresher for those who need it, and to give context to those who don't know about what happened before. Several of Spark 3's plot beats rely on what's occurred in the previous games, so I feel this is important to talk about. In other words, we're going to go into spoilers on all 3 games, so you can skip ahead if you want to avoid those. With that said, let's mosey. So the Spark the Electric Jester games are set on a planet inhabited by these little guys known as Formies. One such Formie is Spark, who at the start of the first game had just gotten his electrical engineering degree, only to get replaced on his first job by a robot. However, with the help of the Jester hat he made, which allows him to conduct electricity, he landed a job at a circus, only to be replaced by a robot again, this time by one that eerily looked like him. While lamenting about his inability to pay rent, he witnesses some robots suddenly going rogue and attacking, and he jumps in to intervene. During the process, he crosses paths with his robotic doppelganger, and decides to pursue him. This eventually gets Spark entangled in a much larger conflict, fighting alongside the scientist Dr. Armstrong and a team of robots against the tyrannical robot Freeome. Dr. Armstrong had previously made Freeome to protect the Mega RAF, a mega computer tower also created by Armstrong for mass robot production. But being programmed with pure independence, Freeome went rogue, using a virus to corrupt robots and serve under him in his plans to wipe out the Formies and take the world for the robots. I already made a Sigma joke regarding Freeome in the last Spark video, so I'll resist this time. It's also revealed that Spark's doppelganger, who Spark has nicknamed Fark, short for Fake Spark, was made to be a double agent against Freeome, but had failed in backstabbing him. In any case, Spark leads the charge against Freeome, successfully putting a stop to his plans, and as a gift of gratitude, Dr. Armstrong wrote Spark a blank check, allowing him to finally cover his rent. Now while Spark 1 keeps things pretty straightforward, Spark 2 is where the story gets a bit more complicated. I'll try to keep it clear though. With Spark keeping himself busy with the blank check, the focus in Spark 2 is now on Fark, who beyond his given mission of backstabbing Freom, has no memories of his past, not even his actual name. Dr. Armstrong, with his creepy 3D eyes, offers to help, but is kidnapped by another robot Jester before he can get anything done, and Fark goes off to save him. During this process, a lot of moving pieces are brought into play. The robot Jester, known as EJ, is revealed to be working under Freom, who's returned and is now plotting to destroy the world. More on that in a moment. Freom's also hired a trio of mercenaries, 2 robots named Double and Flint, and a Formy-termed cyborg named Float, to assist him in hunting down Fark. And there's another Formy named Astra snooping around with her robot companion Romalo, who was an enemy turned ally in the first game. These latter 2 are working under someone simply known as Clarity, but again, more on that in a moment. As Fark seeks out Dr. Armstrong, he crosses paths with several of these characters, with Double, Float, and Astra in particular being destroyed at Fark's hands. Oh yeah, Astra turned out to be a robot created by Clarity, one made to look as real as possible. This will be important much later in the video. But upon crossing paths with Freom, Fark discovers that he was built by Freom himself, being his son of sorts, and upon further pursuit, he finds out a whole lot more about what's going on. Stay with me on this, I'm about to do a lot of lore dumping. As it turns out, the previously mentioned Clarity was an AI built by Dr. Armstrong, and she was given the goal to protect life at all costs. However, this developed into a belief that Formies put that goal in jeopardy, so she influenced Freom into helping her, hence his actions in Spark 1. But upon discovering that Clarity planned on wiping out all life, including robots, Freom rebelled against her. However, her presence was deeply rooted in the planet's network at this point, so Freom felt he could only destroy Clarity by destroying the planet as a whole, and starting the robot utopia anew afterwards. Of course, Fark takes issue with that and beats up Freom, this time destroying his original body. So in a nutshell, Dr. Armstrong made an AI that was designed to be a singularity, which, if you don't know, is a really bad idea, and secretly used Megawrath as a means to further develop the AI, which in turn allowed it to spread its influence across the planet like a virus, all the while making an all-powerful robot without proper moral code to protect this AI, which allowed it to be influenced to further corrupt the planet's robots. TLDR, Armstrong's an idiot. With all that said, that now takes us to Spark 3's story. With the threat of Clarity now looming over the planet more than ever, Fark takes the initiative, finding his way into political power, and with the help of Flint and Armstrong, now with far less creepy 3D eyes, he establishes the Fark Force as a means to attempt to stop Clarity. Networks worldwide are forcefully shut down to prevent her further spread, and robot troops are sent all out to keep an eye out for Clarity-related activity. This doesn't bite all too well with the people though, with Spark in particular no longer being able to access his bank account, or at least not without waiting what's probably a ludicrously long line to get a withdrawal given the circumstances, thus basically negating his blank check. Spark begins to think that Clarity was just a cover-up for Fark's actions and power, and he finally decides to take matter into his own hands, leading to his mission in Spark 3. Okay, I just know that the lineups for withdrawal were probably unbearably long, but even still, there's something funny about Spark's way of thinking. He'd rather try to take down a militarized government force than wait in line at a bank. Then again, this is the same guy who fell for a wallet-stealing prank when he wasn't even carrying a wallet at the time, so I think he's just cursed when it comes to money. Now, compared to Spark 1 and 2, there's actually not a ton of cutscene stuff going on over the course of the game, saving them for choice points of the adventure. Heck, after the initial setup, the next major plot beat introduced on Spark's journey is about halfway through, with the introduction of a female Formy who offers to help him in his fight, as she has info he needs and has a personal connection to the Fark Force. This female Formy was present in some of the game's later marketing, though with no confirmation on who exactly she was. Well, as it turns out, it's Float from Spark 2, now without her cybernetics. This definitely caught me by surprise when I played through the game. I had assumed her defeat at Fark's hands in Spark 2 resulted in her death, but I guess not. Actually, on a related note, while Spark 3 keeps the ongoing story stuff to a minimum, where it really dedicates its time to is in backstories. Throughout the game, you get these sequences going into the backstories of several previously established characters, more specifically, Freom and Clarity, and the trio of Double, Flint, and Float. These also caught me by surprise, albeit in different ways. For one, I didn't think Spark 3 would go into the stories of the trio, given that at the end of Spark 2, Flint was the only one presumably still alive. But hey, we get their stories regardless, and they're quite solid. Oh yeah, Flint's also in the game. He's a part of the Fark Force, being the connection that Float has to it, and is the Guardian you fight a few times throughout. Given both Flint and the Guardian have the same poofy white hair though, I think this was the least surprising twist in the game. But maybe that's just me. But what surprised me about Freom and Clarity's story is in the details. We get to see more of the bond the two shared leading up to them executing their plans, and it's oddly sweet. Like, the two form a friendship, and arguably a romance, and it makes events of previous games far more tragic. Like, you remember how Freom found out that Clarity was plotting to wipe out all life, organic and robotic, and how he felt the need to destroy the whole world to prevent this. Knowing that this is him being betrayed by someone so close to him, it adds a new layer to Freom I wasn't expecting. This game is making me feel for Freom, what the heck? Also, side note, they actually elaborated on Fark's creation and why he was programmed to backstab Freom while also being made by Freom, and even why his memories were taken away. That all felt so confusing to me when playing Spark 1 and 2, but this game actually fleshes that out more and makes it make sense. Thank you, LakeFeperd. Now, there is more story stuff later on in the game that I haven't gone into just yet, but I'm gonna save that for closer to the end. For now, let's get to talking about the gameplay. So much like Spark 2, Spark 3 is a 3D platformer inspired by the Sonic Adventure games. High-speed action with minimal automation is the name of the game here. Spark 2 already handled this very well, and I'm happy to say that that quality not only carried over to Spark 3, but it was increased even further. Spark controls quite a bit better than Fark did in the last game for one, with elements like the Jester dash, Spark's homing attack, being more responsive and snappy than before, and the physics definitely feel more refined. There were moments in Spark 2 where the physics could sometimes hinder your ability to make it through a set piece, but that's far less common than before in Spark 3, which is especially good because some of Spark 3's set pieces get a lot crazier than in the last game. Spark 2 having a cool train level in the latter half of the game, yeah, that concept's used for one of the first levels in Spark 3. This time you're also going to find yourself going through cities in the midst of protests, forest prisons in the midst of being set ablaze, Rail Canyon from Sonic Heroes except it actually works, aircrafts falling apart mid-flight, the trippiest planetarium I've ever seen, and even actual space, complete with oxygen bubbles you need to replenish to survive. Spark 3 feels a lot more creative with the set pieces you go through, and it makes each stage feel very standout. Though not every single stage is just about getting to the end. Many of them are, but some do change things up a bit. Some levels have you rushing to the end in an allotted time, but some have you exploring a more open area in search of medals, needing to collect a certain amount before the time runs out. I can't believe I'm using this as a point of comparison, but they're basically Security Hall from Adventure 2, except with better level design and more wiggle room. Like, LakeFeperd really just looked at Security Hall and said, I can fix it, and then actually did. There's also a level early on where you're once again in an open area and on a time limit, but this time the focus is to get a high enough score, from collecting bits to destroying parts of the stage to defeating enemies, and then heading to one of the goals once your score is high enough. Thinking back, I'm a bit disappointed that there was only one of these stages in the game. This was a fun idea. There's also enemy rush levels where you just go through a gauntlet of enemy waves, which are incredibly fun for reasons I'll go into shortly. And then there's the vehicle levels. I brought up the car section when talking about the demo in my last Spark video, as the demo opens up with this type of gameplay, and sure enough, that's how the full game opens as well. That said, I was pleasantly surprised that there were quite a few car levels throughout the game, and while simple, these are fun. They're based off a racing game project that LakeFeperd had been on and off working on alongside the Spark games, so it's cool to see that work go into something at least. That said, do be careful about your speed when hitting certain turns, otherwise this can happen. That's not the only vehicle level style in the game though. In the city world, there's a couple parts where you pilot this gunship, allowing you to fly about and shoot up enemies and hazards among the skyscrapers. I'll admit that, while not bad, these sections do feel a bit slow, but at the very least, they're short-lived, so it's not like I dreaded whenever these came up. Generally speaking, I find them a bit more tolerant for alternate gameplay styles and platformers. The Crash Bandicoot Warp's one of my favorite 3D platformers, just to give you an idea of what I mean, so I didn't mind the presence of these sections. And now to go into why those enemy rush levels are incredibly fun. As some of you may recall, one of Spark 2's main gameplay aspects was beat-em-up combat, and it was passable. I did say at the start that I had a bit more fun with it on my recent playthrough, but even still, Spark 2's combat definitely felt like it could have used some work. There wasn't really much of a lock-on system, whether automated or manual, and with the minimal number of moves, it did feel kinda button-mashy. And don't get me wrong, I don't mind a button-mashy combat system if it still feels good, but Spark 2's didn't quite feel right. As I said in that original review, it felt like it wanted to commit to being a full-on beat-em-up, but also didn't want to, resulting in a strange in-between. With all that said, I'm happy to report that Spark 3 fixed all of that. Not much of a lock-on system? No problem anymore. It's automated, granted, and there is the very occasional instance where it doesn't quite work as intended, but the game largely does a much better job with lock-on to enemies. Minimal number of moves? No longer the case. You've got a larger variety of melee attacks, alongside a bunch of unlockable moves from the shop. giving you a ton of options for when fighting. Now you could just button mash your way through these combat sequences, but first off, why would you? And secondly, there's a damage multiplier that only goes up from varied combos. And given how much health some of these enemies have, that damage multiplier is very useful. So experimenting with the moves you have is encouraged. And that's all on top of the impact of attacks and the improved sound design. Your attacks feel like they have a lot of weight to them, and it feels really good. Because of that, fights are constantly a blast to partake in whenever they pop up. And I always had a smile on my face when I realized that the next level I was going to be playing was an enemy rush level. Granted, I had a smile on my face for most of my playthrough, but details. And all this is great as is, but then you factor in one other detail with the combat. As you progress through the game, you unlock alternate playstyles, whether that be different forms like the Reaper Jester, or other playable characters like the girl Formy, not gonna say her name for the sake of those who skip the story section, or even Fark himself, who you unlock after you beat the game. You're able to equip these alternate playstyles in your abilities, which you activate via the D-pad, meaning you're able to switch between these on the fly. And not just in a neutral state, you can switch between them mid-combo. And with that little detail, this game's combat system has begun entering Devil May Cry levels of technicality. So yeah, if you couldn't tell, I really love this game's combat. The one aspect that I think Spark 2 did better though with it is blocking and parrying. In Spark 3, you come to a dead stop when using your block, while if you used it in Spark 2 while, say, jumping forward, you'd keep your forward momentum. And I did prefer how it worked there, but in the grand scheme of things, that's pretty minor. All in all, Spark 3's combat has been notably improved, and it helped make the game that much more fun. Though since I mentioned unlocking moves from the shop, I think I can go into that now. Like with Spark 2, Spark 3 has a shop, but has considerably more available to buy with the bits you've collected. I already mentioned the other melee moves, but you can buy upgrades to your already existing abilities, equipable abilities, such as a super boost or a scouter you can use to locate hidden items and levels, and those previously mentioned playstyles. On that note, I will admit that it was a bit disappointing initially that there's even less Jester powers in this game than in Spark 2, with the Reaper Jester being the only one. But the more I think about it, the more that I'm okay with this change. For one, franchises evolve, and it's clear from Spark 2 that the Kirby-like Jester power system wasn't the IP's identity moving forward. And plus, something I thought about after I played the game, Spark 3 having very little of the Jester powers allowed for the electric part of the Electric Jester title to be emphasized. As much as I loved the Jester powers in Spark 1, it did result in Spark's electrokinesis being incredibly overshadowed. So in Spark 3, with less focus on the alternate powers, it allows Spark's electric-based powers to shine in how he fights. And I think that does work to the character's benefit. Though speaking of fights, let's talk about the game's boss battles. I'm a bit half and half on them. There's not as much of a variety of them as I was hoping. 3 of the game's boss fights are basically the exact same fight against the Guardian. But that said, there are still some fun bosses among the bunch. The first boss, Sawman, is quite easy, but honestly, it makes for a fun dummy to practice crazy combos. And yes, I know there is an actual training room in the game, but it's just funnier to watch this massive battle robot get juggled in the air like it's nothing. The 2 coolest fights, though, were the throwback fight and Mecha Madness. The former is a really cool reimagining of one of Spark 1's bosses. Remember the Romalo fight where he'd use static screens to transition you to different arenas against completely different boss enemies? Well, take that idea, put it in 3D, and all the boss enemies you fight are bosses from Spark 2. You get to fight reimaginings of Double, EJ, and the Rhino Dino, all while Spark 2's special boss theme plays. And once you take them down, you get to fight Double at full power. And yep, there's the vocals. Granted, I would have preferred if they used the superior standard boss theme, but I'm not complaining. As for Mecha Madness, well, you have a mech fight with the Guardian. Like, what else do you want me to say? It's a mech fight! Took me a moment to get used to the controls, granted, but even still, it's just a really cool battle. I also love that the combatants are actively moving around in their corner icons as the fight's going on, with Spark's movement being tied to your own. Really cool attention to detail there. There is one other boss of note, but again, I'll save that for later. Moving on to the more technical aspects, I'd first like to address the visuals. In my previous video, I had mentioned that Spark 2 looked pretty good, and while I do stand by that with the environments and some of the character models, namely Fark and Freom, looking back, I can't say I entirely agree. Some of the animations are a bit stiff, and Astra... yeah, no, she looks kinda off. I wouldn't say the game looks ugly, but it's clear that there was room for improvement. Something that Spark 3 definitely takes advantage of. The environments look just as good as before, if not better, and the character models and animations have very much improved. Spark especially has some wonderfully done expressions all throughout, and the new style of animating faces on the formies compared to how it was done in Spark 2 was a really good call. Like I said earlier, even Dr. Armstrong doesn't look creepy anymore. The one change I would have made personally to the presentation, though, is to the subtitles and cutscenes. The usual text boxes are fine, but for these cutscenes that don't stop for text boxes, the choice of subtitle font and presentation I think could have been better. I didn't personally struggle to read these, but I imagine one could with the way it blends in with the scene. Though as for the music, it's good stuff. No crazy vocal themes this time, unfortunately, but we've got a nice blend of largely techno and rock all throughout, and it suits the gameplay really well. And even outside of gameplay, a lot of these are great to listen to. Some personal favorites are the themes for Drinian Desert, Protest Prison, Protest City, Pacific Abyss, and one of the endgame bosses I haven't talked about yet. Though even some of its slower songs are quite pleasant as well, with the song that plays for the Freom and Clarity flashback cutscene being a particular highlight. Seriously, give the soundtrack a listen, it's great. Now as for the performance, it's mostly solid. I did have the occasional frame drop here and there, and as I noted earlier, I had some very brief freezes at points. No more than a couple frames, but yeah, it happened regardless. Now granted, like I said at the start, my computer was being stubborn while I was recording my playthrough, so it could just be tied to that. Beyond that though, the game never felt unplayable at any point performance-wise. Even the occasional frame drops were never drastically so. As for glitches, I don't ever really recall experiencing any. Well, aside from this. Not entirely sure what happened there. With all that said though, I think it's finally time to talk about the finale. So before we go in, I'm first going to give a spoiler warning, skip ahead if you don't want to see what goes on in the finale, but also I want to give a content warning, as things are about to get quite dark. Not graphically, but thematically. This finale deals with stuff like existentialism, just to give you an idea of what to expect. If you'd rather not hear about that, I'd also recommend skipping ahead. I'll give you a moment to do so. We all good? Alright, let's dive into this. So for starters, right as you select the final level, you get this ominous warning. The finale's a long one and is going to test you on everything. There's no opportunity to save in between the levels and bosses, and most notably, this. Throughout the game, you've been collecting medals of various kinds. Freedom medals just for beating the levels, but also score medals and time medals for finishing levels with a high enough score or in a fast enough time, and exploration medals that are hidden away in many of the levels. These have all seemed pretty unimportant so far, aside from the freedom medals which have been unlocking levels for you, but now everything you've collected is going to influence how many lives you have for this final stage. And no, they ain't bluffing. I checked out the level again once I had a couple more medals, and that life counter at the start was higher. So you enter the final level, and you start off with one last showdown against Flint, which is basically the same fight as the ones you had before with him. But then you enter the level itself, Utopia Shelter. The warning at the start wasn't exaggerating. This level's significantly longer than every other level in the game, with my run of it taking 23 minutes. And it tests you on everything. If there's any mechanic you haven't mastered by this point, you better hope you've got a fair number of lives. In my case, I started with 16 lives and ended the level with 12. But even though I only lost a handful of my lives, it definitely was not an easy road to get through. Very fun test of skill though. At the end of it all, Spark finally finds Fark, whose new look seems to have a hint of Freom in it. Spark, of course, demands for Fark to disband the Fark Force, and Fark agrees to without hesitation. Spark, being understandably confused, asks what the catch is, and then Fark reveals there's a lot more going on than it seems. He explains everything that went on after Spark 2, him discovering more about Clarity, entering political power, forming the Fark Force to try and stop Clarity, everything we went over earlier. And it's through this that we also learn Clarity's plan. She intends to assimilate every living being, organic and robotic, into her system, trapping it in her virtual world so she can, quote, protect it all, and disposing of the actual living things after. Clarity was an immense danger to the world, and Fark intended to do everything in his power to stop her, shutting down the networks, sending out robots to seek out Clarity-related activity, and keeping their base underground to try and hide from her. But Spark's interference brought about a problem, albeit not an intentional one. Remember what I said earlier about Clarity making a lifelike robot in the form of Astra in Spark 2? Well, this version of Float was also that. The actual Float from Spark 2 did die when Fark defeated her, and the Float that had joined Spark was merely a robotic replica of her. And by bringing her along, Spark allowed her, and by extension Clarity, to enter the heart of the Fark Force and successfully assimilate everything. Everything we just played through, Spark's journey through this game, all of it was just a simulation of the past within Clarity's virtual reality. We're not fighting to stop Clarity from assimilating the world, because she already did. And as discovered later on, Spark's actual attempt to take down the Force, which inadvertently allowed Clarity to succeed, this all occurred thousands of years ago now. And while Fark wasn't able to be fully assimilated due to the way Freom and Clarity had first made him, meaning he still had his own body, Spark's body is long gone. This part even gets scarily meta, as Clarity herself reveals that Spark's mind within her reality has basically been on loop, going through his adventure to stop the Force over and over again, sometimes doing it as fast as he can, sometimes taking his time. Spark, understandably, doesn't take this all too well, but Fark provides a glimmer of hope. Due to the nature of his creation, he found a way to siphon some of Clarity's power, but because he wasn't fully assimilated, it was only to a degree. With Spark, though, as he is fully assimilated, they could feasibly take control of the simulation from Clarity. But then Clarity takes control of Spark before they can act. Now, playing as Fark, you take on the possessed Spark, with his first two forms being the freaky shadow creatures from Fark's What If campaign in Spark 1. This fight's honestly pretty cool as well, and getting to play as Fark again is a nice touch that ties the trilogy together from a gameplay perspective. Once defeated though, Spark, now being present in the simulation's main system, takes the opportunity to fully process everything he just learned. Him being assimilated, his body having died thousands of years ago, and accepting that he's just a duplicate. But, being in the main system, he discovers of Clarity's core, and now he and Fark have a means to eliminate her. With their powers combined, they fuse into an all-new form known as Sparks. That name is ridiculous and I kinda love it, and go off to fight Clarity's core, Claritas Centralis. Now admittedly, while not a bad fight, I do think the final battle against Claritas Centralis is a bit underwhelming, especially compared to the previous two games' final bosses. Clarity may be the stronger of the two, but Freom definitely knew how to put up a better fight. But I think the Shadow Creatures fight before and, well, the finale as a whole makes up for this. In any case, Clarity is destroyed, and Spark now has complete control of the virtual reality, and he tells Fark that he's going to be freeing Fark from the simulation before shutting the whole thing down, destroying it once and for all. And thus, Spark gives his final goodbyes to Fark. And then Fark says, yeah, no, you ain't killing yourself, and basically goes Gurren Lagann on Spark, slapping some sense into him and telling him that they're restoring the world together. And so Spark 3 ends, with the two of them, Fark on the outside and Spark on the inside, now aiming to bring the world to a better state. And to those who follow me on Twitter, now you know why I said I needed a moment once I beat the game. Like, wow, this finale goes a bold direction. Just the fact that the game went through with the idea of Clarity succeeding in her plans, let alone that the game takes place after she's already done so, I could have not predicted that going into this. And while yes, Clarity Centralis herself is kind of a lackluster final boss, I think everything else regarding this finale is really well done. From the solid final level, to the horrifying plot twist, to the penultimate boss fight that calls back to Spark 1, and even that ridiculous final form that I can't help but love. I'm definitely not gonna forget this finale anytime soon. So with all that said, yeah, I loved this game. It may not hit everything out of the park, but everything it does, it hits real hard. It's an incredibly fun 3D platformer that not only scratches that Sonic Adventure itch, but also goes beyond being more than just an indie Sonic Adventure successor. For me at least, Spark the Electric Jester has developed its own identity as a series, and I especially feel that with Spark 3, which I can easily say is my favorite of the trilogy. For those curious to try it, it's currently Steam exclusive, but LakeFeperd has noted that he's aiming to get this on consoles eventually. But yeah, Spark the Electric Jester 3 is an easy recommendation from me. And if this ain't at the top of my favorite games of 2022 when I eventually cover that topic, I'll be genuinely surprised. So LakeFeperd, thank you for making this. You did a fantastic job. And on that note, I think I'll wrap up things right here. This has been BenjaMage, thank you all for watching, and until the next video, have a nice day everybody.